potentially the FDA is more straightforward now than the European approval process. Yeah, the real focus should be on improving patient outcomes, and we really felt they were the right partner to take it forward. We were essentially trying to convince clinicians to change their practice. He gave me a 3-day crash course in childbirth, and it was very exciting, but it was also very daunting. We didn't have any investors involved. We sort of bootstrapped the business from the beginning.
Hi, and welcome to our new episode of Digital Health Interviews. Traditionally, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to our channel and like this video. And I also want to encourage you to support Ukrainians in any possible way. We need this, and it's really important for us. And now I'm finally very excited to introduce our today's guest. He came straight from London to New York City and was very kind enough to dedicate some time for this interview. So his name is Nish Varma. Hi, Nish.
Hi, Alex. Good to be here.
You have a quite fascinating journey, and you moved from finance to women's health. Please tell us a bit about how that happened and what do you do now?
Of course, yeah. It is an unusual journey, but it's been very interesting. It's been very rewarding in many ways. And my career initially started in finance. I worked for an investment bank as an equity analyst for several years. Around that time, my father, who is an OBGYN, back in 2011 now, while I was in the middle of my career, he was doing his usual practice, but he came across a very tragic scenario within his hospital. A mother was due to give birth normally on the day of the delivery. They couldn't deliver the baby normally. It led to an emergency cesarean section. They really struggled to get the baby out because by the time they started the C-section, the baby's head was impacted in the pelvis. They had to ask a nurse to actually manually push up the baby's head from below. They delivered the baby. My father was called into the hospital. He came in. He helped repair the mother who had suffered extension tears to the uterine incision. And very, very tragically, about 12 hours after the delivery, he got a call saying that the baby did not survive the delivery due to multiple skull fractures that had been sustained. So a really, really tragic case, but it led him to try and find a way of solving this problem and trying to make these types of deliveries safer. So it led him on a journey to create a prototype. He spent the next couple of years developing a device which would ultimately be called the fetal pillow. And it's essentially a balloon device that's inflated. It's inserted underneath the baby's head. It inflates about 3 to 4 centimeters, elevates the head out of the pelvis, and then makes delivery much easier to perform. No need for any manual elevation techniques. So he had told me about this story that had happened. He had told me that he was thinking of an idea to try and solve the problem. And I was fascinated by it. And even though I had my own career in finance, I had no interest or plans to get involved with medicine. I decided at that point to leave my career in finance and partner with my father and try and help him bring this product to patients across the globe eventually.
So did you know from day one that it's not going to be a useful product but also a successful business?
I didn't know any of this, to be honest. I took a leap of faith. My dad always jokes that when I decided to join him, he gave me a 3-day crash course in childbirth. So he tried to summarize his 30 years of experience into 3 days and teach me the basics of childbirth so I could go and start speaking to doctors. But no, I really had no idea. I knew that he was trying to solve a problem. I knew that I could help in some way. I could learn the business of medical devices, and there were lots of transferable skills from my career, especially on the sales side. I had a finance and business background, so I knew I could help with the business side of things and the commercial aspect. But no, I didn't know where it would lead. But we tried our best, and we really figured it out as we went along.
So I assume you started with the UK market. What were the first initial challenges you faced?
Yeah, so it was initially launched into the UK market, and I really wanted to learn from the ground up. So really my first day on the job, as it were, I was going into UK hospitals, speaking to clinicians, introducing the device to them. It was a real challenge in those early days because there was not really any clinical data on the device, and we were essentially trying to convince clinicians to change their practice. Previously, they delivered these babies using the the original techniques, the manual techniques, and there was really never any need for a device. They didn't see a need for a device because some of the doctors hadn't come across this problem. I think one thing to mention is that the problem that led to my father developing the device is still relatively uncommon. So often you'd speak to doctors and they would say, well, I don't really see a need for this. So it was a real challenge to convince clinicians in those early days with limited data. Interestingly, the more time we spent speaking to doctors, we realized that we were coming across more and more doctors who had come across the problem, maybe with not such tragic consequences, but they'd come across the problem, there'd be a difficult delivery, that typically the mother would suffer complications. So that we realized was far more common than the complications for the baby. So we started to see that story develop over the years in the UK market. But it was a challenge, convincing them initially.
Can imagine. What was the regulatory path to start adopting the product?
Yeah, I mean, at the time we had to go through the CE mark for the UK and the European market. I know that's changed slightly since Brexit, but at the time we had to go through the CE marking process. We were fortunate enough that there was a doctor in India who had actually reached out to us. He had heard about the device. He was very interested in collecting some data within his hospital. So he did a small pilot study within his hospital. And there were a couple of other institutions that collected small amounts of data. So we fortunately had a few cases that we could present as part of that regulatory process. That really helped us get the CE mark. It was relatively straightforward at the time. Things have changed quite dramatically since then. The changes to MDR, the regulatory pathway is becoming more difficult, and I think potentially the FDA is more straightforward now than the European approval process. Yeah.
Interesting. So you got approved. You started selling the device, and you at some point you're like, okay, it's time to scale. It's time to expand. We're looking at other European countries first, or straight you went to the US?
Well, the plan was always go to the US at some point. That was the most important market, biggest just in terms of birthing volumes, because the way that we would sort of analyze the size of a market was the number of births. Right. So the US, with close to 4 million births, I mean, it's come down to probably about 3.6, 3.7 million now. Much bigger market than the UK, for example, which is about 500,000 births per year. But at the time, we knew that we wanted to go to the FDA, but we probably needed more data before we could approach the FDA. So really our focus was the UK, European markets as well. But an interesting market that became quite an important one for us was Australia and New Zealand. A doctor had heard about the device, a doctor in Australia, quite a key hospital, the Mater Hospital in Australia, and he approached us because they had actually had a very similar case in his hospital where they had lost a baby. He approached us. We then went through the regulatory process in Australia, had it approved there, and that actually became our second biggest market after the UK. In Europe, we did expand into Europe as well. We were in about between 10 and 15 countries in Europe. And we really worked with distribution partners in countries outside of the UK and Australia. But the Scandinavian countries adopted the technology quite quickly. But we found quite early on that just due to cultural differences, and it was quite fragmented, the European market. So adoption was, slower than we had expected, and that comes with the challenges of working with distributors as well. But yes, we did expand into Europe, but really the goal was to look at the US market when we were ready.
And I assume you started the preparation to counter this market much earlier, right?
We did. We started the preparations. We had been in the UK and Europe, Australia, probably for about 3 or 4 years before we decided to engage with the FDA. So probably 2015 was when we started thinking about the FDA process, because several studies had been published at that point. So we had quite a lot of data available on the device. So then we engaged with the FDA, and we realized that actually we could take the de novo pathway because there were no predicate devices, because really our device was the only device that was available to solve this problem. So there were no predicate devices that we could use as part of a 510K application. So we took the de novo pathway. And actually, interestingly, the FDA seemed quite excited by the discussion and the potential for a device like this, because it was something that was brand new to the market. And I think at the time we approached the FDA, there were about, with all the data that had been published, there were about 600 patient cases that we could present to them. And I think the really big benefit for us at the time was that the FDA did not require or did not ask for any additional clinical data at the time, because that was our one concern. They may turn around and say, well, actually, you need some data from the US before we can clear this for use. But we didn't have that issue at the time.
Did you go through all the process by yourself? I mean, you and your team, or you actually hire like consultants?
It's a great question, and I speak to a lot of startups at the moment, and they thinking about the FDA pathway, and they're speaking to several consultants. We didn't have a positive experience, so there are a couple of consultants that we used. One of them actually recommended the 510K pathway, which turned out to be incorrect for us. So we wasted a bit of time there. And it's funny because my dad sort of decided that he would engage with the FDA directly himself. So we didn't bother working with any consultants in the end. We decided we would manage it ourselves. And he engaged directly with the FDA. There was a lot of back and forth, and I think they really appreciated speaking directly with the clinician and the founder of the business. And often they would make suggestions, and my dad would, make counter arguments towards their suggestions, and they would, agree with a lot of things that he said because it made clinical sense. So that's the way we took, which is also quite unusual, because usually they're consultants who, claim to be the experts. But in our case, we managed it ourselves, and it was the right decision.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what you said, that 510K clearance was the wrong path for you?
It often boils down to the type of device you have. First, the class of the device is quite important. If it's a class 3 device, you typically will have to go down a 510K pathway, and they will require clinical data. Also, it's quite important to determine if there are predicate or similar devices in the market. If you take the example of another medical device, which is the Barclay balloon for postpartum hemorrhage, there's a few of these balloons on the market. So if, for example, you were to try and create another version of this product, you would typically use one of the predicates that's already in the market, and that would kind of guide the pathway that you take. But in our case, there was no predicate device. So the de novo is kind of the novel devices that are on the market, and it is typically a faster sort of pathway to regulatory clearance.
So it's interesting, while you were preparing for all the documentation for FDA and getting the clearance, did you already start finding partners or talking to hospitals, signing some LOIs, so you kind of have the sales base where you're going to sell it before you actually got approval?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the way that we started building a network of clinicians and hospital groups is in the sort of 2 or 3 years prior to FDA clearance. We were cleared by the FDA in sort of late 2017. So in the years prior, we typically attended the major national obstetric conferences. So there's 2 key conferences that happen each year. One is the ACOG conference, the American College of OBGYN. They have a conference every year, and then there's the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, the SMFM conference as well. So they're the 2 major conferences where you have probably 2,000 to 3,000 clinicians in attendance, OBGYNs, and you'll typically have senior clinicians there as well that are kind of the leaderships of their own hospital departments. So we would typically attend those conferences. We would take a small exhibition booth there, and we would have our device on display. We had to be very careful about not being seen to market a device that wasn't cleared by the FDA. So we had to put a banner up saying that this is not yet cleared by the FDA. But we were able to start having early conversations with clinicians, demonstrate the device to them, explain that it was not cleared by the FDA yet, but that was hopefully the plan in the next couple of years. We could then, if they were interested in being kept informed and up to date, they would leave their contact information. So we started slowly building a database of clinicians that way. The letter of intents, that we never actually obtained any of those. I think it was a bit too early for us at the time because It was a challenge to get any sort of letter because it was not clear when or if we would be cleared by the FDA. So clinicians typically weren't willing to provide those kinds of letters, but they were very happy for us to have their contact information and keep them up to date. And as soon as it was clear, they were willing to then have a discussion about how they might implement it into their hospitals.
So late 2017, you get approval. What happens next? You just buy a ticket to New York City and start actually selling?
It was an interesting moment because it was such a big milestone for us as a business. And it was very exciting, but it was also very daunting because there was me, my father, we had another partner. There were three of us in the UK that sort of owned the business. We had our employee and partner in Australia as well, but we had no presence in the US market. So we then really had to start figuring out a way. Now, how do we bring our device to the US? And that was quite daunting in many ways because it's, as you know, it's a big territory and every state slightly different, and there's a lot of things to kind of manage. But there's a lot that we did and we had to do. I think I mentioned the contacts that we had from the US conferences. We could start initially approaching some of those hospitals. The way that we approached it, and again, at the time we didn't know what was the right or wrong way to do it, but I decided that I would personally spend time in New York and actually do it myself, try and introduce our device to some of the big hospitals in New York, because logistically it's not too difficult to get to from London. So that was the first kind of action on my agenda, was to spend some time in New York. And that's really where I started just doing research. I mean, I didn't have any contacts apart from maybe a handful from the conferences. I started researching, who are the big hospital groups in the city. I could obtain birthing volumes for each of the hospitals, so I could really create a short list of the top 10 birthing hospitals in the city. I could then try and find out who were the decision makers in the department, try and get their contact information, either through contacts we already had or really just cold emailing doctors in New York. So that's how we did it. At the same time, the other thing to mention is we were introduced to a handful of independent distributors in the US. These are typically small businesses, almost sort of family-run businesses that would have their own reps, and they would typically carry several different products within their bag. So we had some sort of early relationships with some distributors, and that's when we started really engaging with them and saying that, look, we now are ready to market this in the US. Are you interested in partnering with us in your territories to start bringing us to the market? So that's kind of how we approached it.
But what worked better, your personal efforts or distribution channel?
Yeah, I mean the distributor is a whole separate discussion we could have, but it's challenging. The distributors are challenging in many respects because they may have 5 or 6 different products that they're selling. And with a product like ours, because it was brand new to the market, there was a substantial investment in time that's required by the distributors. So they may not see the benefits of, generating revenues in those early, potentially 6 months, because brand new product, you're having to go through the convincing clinicians. So there is that kind of adoption cycle which takes time. My experience in New York was very positive. I had a lot of experience by that point in terms of selling in the UK. And I actually think the UK was a far more challenging market. So I think that prepared me quite well for the US. But the one thing that surprised me, a pleasant surprise, was in the US market, the culture was very different. They were very welcoming towards innovation and patient safety. In the UK, when you're having an initial conversation, typically, before you even finished explaining, they're asking for the data. Where's the data on this? And you're kind of on the back foot. In the US, obviously they're interested in the data as well, but before they even asked about data, they were just very excited. They said, "This is a fantastic idea. I'd love to use this. How do we get it into a hospital?" So that was the kind of conversations I was having early on. And I had a lot of success in New York. In that first sort of year and a half, I was able to get the device approved by the major systems in New York, New York Presbyterian, Mount Sinai, NYU, Northwell Health. So I had good success. It wasn't easy because I was living in the UK. I was really traveling basically back and forth every month. So that was tiring, as you can imagine. But it was a really positive experience. Once we had some of these major hospital systems in New York using the product, it really helped our distributors because they could then start referencing some of these major hospitals. And then we started seeing momentum with the distributors as well. They were starting to open up accounts in their territories. They were the conversations that I just mentioned about with the clinicians. They were also having the same discussions when they were bringing this to clinicians. The clinicians were very excited, and I think it's quite refreshing for the distributors because they maybe have had products that maybe had been around for a few years, maybe were less innovative, less exciting. So I think they were really enjoying having conversations about our device. So when you speak to the distributors now, they really enjoyed selling the Fetal Pillow in the market, and they had good success.
Just kind of step back. How much time did it take from actually starting those conversations and actually signing your first contract in the US?
Yeah, that's, it really varied depending on the hospital you spoke to. The kind of sales cycle did vary quite significantly. But if I always remember the kind of the very first hospital that approved Fetal Pillow in New York was NYU in Long Island. Actually, it wasn't NYU at the time, it was a standalone hospital. It was Winthrop Hospital at the time, but it since has been acquired by NYU. They deliver about 5,000 babies. They're quite an important academic site. So as part of my research, I sort of identified them as a key target. I managed to find the obstetric chair of the department. He had published a lot of literature in his field, and I found his email address, and I just sent him a short email, and I said, introducing myself, explaining my father's story, and hope for the best. And he replied a couple of hours later, said, "Oh, this sounds great. Happy to meet you." And then I think my father flew out. So we had the device proved, I think it was September, October 2017. I think we flew out to New York, probably about November, December time, met with him. He absolutely loved the idea. He brought in some of his colleagues, so we gave a short presentation, and my father shared the clinical story about why he developed the device. And they were immediately bought in, and they said, yeah, we really want to try this. We agreed to give them some samples. I think we gave them 18 fetal pillows at the time. They started using them over those next few weeks, and we kept in touch with them, and they gave some feedback, and they said they had a really, really great experience with the product. Some of these deliveries that are previously very challenging that were made much easier. So they were really impressed with the device. And there was a clinician there who was sort of decided to be the champion for the product, and he reached out to me and said, look, I need a bit more information. Can you send me the clinical data? Because I'm going to present this to the purchasing department within their hospital. Sent him the information. Probably about a month later, they got it signed off. So I think we had the initial meeting in November, and I think they went through their evaluation devices, and then I believe they placed their first order in February. So probably 3 months or so after the initial meeting, which was amazing. When I compared that to the UK, there were hospitals that took 2 years to approve the device. So that was a refreshing experience. And I wouldn't say it represented the whole of the US or even the whole of New York. There were some far more complicated sales cycles, but it was a good start. So yeah.
For sure. All right. So end of 2017, and then in 4 years, you already get acquired. Tell us more about how that happened.
Yeah, so actually, it was essentially 3 years, because if we say that we launched roughly 2018, we were acquired in March of 2021, so it's around 3 years. So relatively short space of time in the US market. Now, I think when people hear our story, they think that Cooper Surgical kind of came out of the blue, acquired us very quickly. But actually, the interesting thing is we had a relationship and communication with them for probably about 5 years or so before they acquired us. I mentioned that we would spend time at the national conferences. Cooper Surgical, we kind of laughed about it because we had the smallest, cheapest booth at the conference. And then when you looked at these companies like Cooper Surgical and Labary, Organon, they had these huge booths there, So, but anyways, they would typically have some of their team that were walking around the stands, and I think they were keeping an eye out on some of the innovations that were out there. They're obviously, a lot of these companies are, they are very interested in acquiring innovative technologies. So they came across us quite early. We had a conversation at the booth. We exchanged contact information, and they were very interested in just keeping the dialogue open with us. They said, please let us know when this is cleared by the FDA. We'd love to just, keep in touch. And then each time we'd attend the conference, we would have an informal meeting with them, have a coffee together, and give them a bit of an update on what we were doing. When we were cleared by the FDA, we then let them know, and we could see they were more interested, because now I think that's one of the big risks. They're less interested before regulatory approvals, and so we got to that stage, and then they were interested. But again, nothing really transpired that quickly, because we got the sense that they wanted us to sort of prove the market ourselves, prove that the business model worked, prove that there was a need for it in the US. So that's what we really focused on doing. But they kept in touch with us, and then they obviously have so many reps across the country that are on the ground. And I think where we were having success in New York, throughout the country through our distributors, I think their reps were starting to hear about the device. The reps are in the field selling other products, and they were starting to hear more about Feet2Pillow. So there was kind of noise in the market over that period of time. And then I think they realised when they saw that we had success at some of these really big kind of key institutions in the country. I think the other thing to mention is that was another big sort of development for us in the US. The Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, they had approached us. Actually, it was sort of prior to FDA clearance. They had approached us and said, "Oh, is anyone in the US going to do a study on this?" And we said, "We haven't really had any of those conversations yet." So they actually completed a randomized study on our device, and that got published. Can't remember the exact time it was now, but it got published a couple of years after you'd been in the market. So that was another huge development that really got the attention of some of the the strategics and bigger players in the industry.
So when you joined the company with your father, was that the what we call an exit strategy from the early beginning to be acquired by someone?
You know what? I think just our journey is just so unusual in many ways, because I know a lot of companies out there are raising lots of money, and when you have sort of investors involved, there really is a sort of path or a goal to be acquired, because investors need their return. We didn't have any investors involved. We sort of bootstrapped the business from the beginning, and we never really had a goal to sell the business. If you ask my father, his real goal was to try and, the case that led him to develop the device, he just didn't want any family to go through that again. So his ultimate goal was to just get this out to as many mothers and their babies as possible. I think as we had success in the US market, at that time, I think we started realizing that there may be interest in an acquisition, because we then started realizing that that's where the kind of acquisition activity was in the US. That's where the bigger players were based. And then we were starting to have a few of these kind of informal conversations with some of the bigger players. So we could see there was interest at that stage. And I think my dad realized at that time that probably us as a small company wouldn't have been able to do it justice. His ultimate goal, it would have to have been taken on by a bigger player to reach that goal, to get it out to kind of, globally.
But overall, you as co-founders, are you satisfied with that decision? Or maybe we should have waited for one more year, we could be acquired for...
Yeah, it's always it's a hard one, because you never know when, it was new to us, right. Building a business, selling a business. So it was really difficult to judge when would be the right time. But I think looking back, it was definitely the right decision, because we were seeing a lot of success in the US, but we realized that one company having it in their portfolio with, reps throughout the country would be the best way to get this out there. So at the time, we sort of realized it was the right decision. And I mentioned that we had this relationship with Cooper Surgical. We kind of got to know them a little bit over the years, and it was important for us to find the right partner as well. And we really felt they were the right partner to take it forward. So overall, it was the right decision for us. Yeah.
Well, I think this is really amazing and inspiring story. I really love businesses where there's a big idea behind it to actually do good in healthcare. So I'm really happy everything turned out well for you.
Thank you.
So I think you worked for another year for Cooper Surgical after acquisition, and what happens next?
Yeah, so I mean that 1 year was interesting because the way that the deal was structured, we had the majority of the payment up front, but then there was an earn-out attached to the deal as well. So we had a milestone to achieve to obtain the remainder of the payout. So it was an important decision that we made as part of the deal that we would continue to be involved for that 1 year period. We felt that we had to be quite closely involved to sort of transfer our knowledge over to the Cooper Surgical's sales teams. So we remained involved for that 1 year period. Unfortunately, we hit the earn-out target, so that was a great result for us and Cooper Surgical. And that was a really kind of enjoyable experience because I got to sort of, even though I had experience working in a big company for an investment bank, this was interesting working for a big company in the medical device world and seeing how they operate and seeing, a company with a large amount of resources behind them. And it was exciting for us because we were doing everything kind of, bootstrapped. But then suddenly we had a big company that could put all of the marketing resources behind it, could have all of their reps on the ground selling it. So that was an exciting year for us to see that kind of transition and also support the transition.
Very cool. And what do you do now?
So now I guess if I go back to after the acquisition and the earn-out, when that finished with Cooper Surgical, I took a bit of time out, had a young daughter at the time, and just took some time out to spend with the family. And, we spent a long time and many years of hard work building the business. So I took a little bit of time out. But over that period, we had a lot of companies and founders and startups and even clinicians who had heard about the success that we had, and they were reaching out to us for informal advice. They were maybe developing products. So I did a bit of mentoring during that time and just sharing our experience. And then I sort of decided actually I could probably help a lot of businesses just with the experiences that we've had. I think there's a lot of companies on a similar journey. And I then decided to set up my own consulting business. It's called OBG Access. So it's a business I set up about a year and a half ago. And OBG Access, the name really is just to provide access to these medical device startups to my knowledge, and probably more importantly is my network of clinicians and hospital groups in the US, and really help these companies bring their products and technologies to the US market. So that's what I do now. I work with about 5 companies with exciting technologies, and I'm helping them. They're all at slightly different stages in their journey.
But all in women's health?
All in women's health, exactly. Yeah, all in women's health. And I am essentially helping them and guiding them through that process. I guess longer term, our plan. My father actually has a couple of other device ideas. It's a small black book of notes that he's collected and made over the last 20 years or so. And he has ideas from even before Fetal Pillow, around that time, that he ideas that he had. But then he very much put all of his energy into the Fetal Pillow. And that's where we obviously spent our time. So we had a conversation, about a year ago, and he's got a couple of other ideas. He's still practicing actually as an obstetrician as a gynecologist in the UK. But the plan is to potentially develop a couple of new devices and go through the process and patent them, go through the regulatory process, and then at that stage I'll probably take over and try and commercialize them. And I think we'll actually avoid the UK and Europe this time and potentially just go straight to the US. That's the plan, I think. Yeah. So,
were you thinking about expanding and going outside of women's health and childbirth?
Yeah, me personally, I really enjoy this space. I think the real value that I can add to some of these companies is the network, opening the doors to have conversations with clinicians. One example might be startups that are trying to collect data, for example, or trying to get a study, trying to find research interest from hospitals and clinicians. I can really open up some doors there. So in that sense, women's health is probably going to be my focus going forward. But actually, there's a lot of knowledge, I think, that we built up over those years that will be applicable more broadly to the medical device world. And one thing that I'm sort of started working on is maybe creating some educational content just to share some of our knowledge in a broader way that might help just other medical device businesses.
And by the way, Nish has an amazing newsletter. We'll add a link in the description of this video, so subscribe and you'll learn much more about his experience and other insights that he shares.
Thank you. Yeah. Hope you enjoy reading it.
I do.
Good.
All right. Finally, your last piece of advice for startup founders, specifically in medical device space.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we learnt, over the years. My advice really for startup founders is, I think, don't necessarily try and build the business with the goal to sort of exit. I think the real focus should be on, improving patient outcomes. That should be the real goal, and building a business that is reflective of that goal to help patients. If you do that successfully and you're able to build a business, the interest will come from strategic partners. That'll come. I think there's so many things that you can start thinking about early on in your journey. You need to start thinking about clinical data, for example, because when you bring a product to the market, whether it's a new innovation, whether there are other competitors out there on the market already, you really need to try and collect some clinical data to show the efficacy, show that it actually does what you're saying it does. So I think that's hugely important. And really just trying to, it's interesting because when you speak to my dad again about his journey, developing a product, going through the regulatory process, that's sort of one, obviously very important part of the puzzle. But then when you get past those hurdles, the actual commercialization and bringing it to the market is a whole different challenge. So another piece of advice I have is start thinking about that early on in your journey. Think about the commercialization journey and process and how you may do that. And that can come about in many ways. It can be starting to engage with clinicians early on, starting to build up that network. Think about how your sort of distribution channels. Will you work with independent distributors? Will you work with a national partner? Will you hire direct reps? So I'd start thinking about that sort of distribution effort early on. And then probably the other thing to think about is start engaging with some of the strategic partners early on, because I think it really helps to build those relationships early. Because when the time comes, if you do plan to exit and you've already built up those relationships, that really helps with the sort of exit process.
All great pieces of advice. Thank you, Nish.
Thank you.